Welcome to the Career Meets World podcast, Polina. I am super pumped to have you on today. And I want to dive into things really quick because you have such a rich background, rich history. You've done incredible things in your life. You kind of have this really unique upbringing. So, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. I love the energy already. That being said, look, you've done some incredible things. You made some leaps and bounds and transitions throughout your life. And I want to make sure that people listening who might not know you yet really get to know who you are. We're going to uncover your background. So if you can start, just give people a high level overview of who Polina is.
Oh man, getting into identity real quick. Um, I I like to think of myself as a writer and just a curious person. I my family and I moved from Bulgaria when I was 8 years old to Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up in the South. I went to the University of Georgia. Then I really wanted to pursue journalism and writing. And I knew that the media capital of the world was New York City. So my whole, from graduating from college until I moved to New York, I spent my time figuring out how to get there. I was also painfully naive in that I didn't know that $30,000 in Atlanta, Georgia, compared to $30,000 in New York City a year is maybe a little bit of a different quality of life if you make that salary, but I didn't care. And I didn't know. So I ended up moving to New York, worked at a startup for 6 months, and then I made my way to Fortune magazine, where I spent 5 years. And while I was there, I started a little something on the side called The Profile, which is a weekly newsletter where I curate some of the best long form profiles of people and companies. And I recently left in March of 2020 to work on it full time.
I love that. The best is really the understatement and all of that. It is really one of the most prolific things that you can read about different people. And we're going to unpack that. But before we get into that, I want to make sure that we really understand your background, right? You hit
Yeah.
on the word identity. You know really quickly how passionate I am about understanding somebody's identity because that's what lends you to who you are today. Moving from Bulgaria to Atlanta, Georgia is not a recipe that most people would blend up. And I'm just curious if you could share a little bit about your family's journey, your experiences. Like, what was it like being a kid in Atlanta, not really knowing?
I think that I think you and I share this fascination with identity because I think it says a lot about someone by the way they brand and or label themselves. So I could have easily come on the show and been like, "Hey, I'm Polina, I'm an immigrant." And like let that stand on its own, right? I think for such a long time my family had that label not necessarily put on by us but by other people, right? Oh, they're immigrants. They live in this neighborhood. They speak another language. They're different. For me, that was, I mean, in Bulgaria, I spent first and second grade, and I was a wildly social kid. I would say I was like confident on the border of arrogant. Like I felt good, right? And when we moved to the US, suddenly I was stripped of my friends. I was stripped of my identity that I had made for myself in first and second grade. I did not speak the language. We didn't know anybody. We didn't have any money. Like it was just, you start over. I'm sure you're very familiar with this journey. But when I got to elementary school here, they put me in fourth grade. So suddenly, again, I was the youngest out of everybody. It was a hard, bizarre time, but it was hard because for somebody who used to be very expressive, suddenly not being able to express yourself, not being able to read and write, and not being able to communicate with others made me incredibly introverted, which was another label that I put on myself going into middle school and high school. And I think the very journey of the immigrant path of moving from one country to another can actually reshape who you are, whether you're 8 years old, 18, or 55. And I think for me, it reshaped like, um, I became introverted. I kind of changed my personality a little bit to fit in more. And I think I over rotated way too much. So I would shed the label of immigrant, which was stupid, but I realized that later. And but the fundamentals of I like to communicate, I like to ask questions, and I like to read and write, that never went away. That was true in Bulgaria, and that was also true here. It just took me a little bit while longer to get to that place where I could fully express myself. And because I couldn't speak the language, writing, I mean, that was kind of like my escape.
What happened in that moment, right? Where it takes a few years to learn that language and to assimilate into the culture, to understand who you are as a human being. Once you were able to find the words, the language again, was there some breakthrough, or is it just realization that now I know English, now I can actually express myself the way I want to?
It's actually a great question because I hadn't thought about this until literally just now. So when I first got to my elementary school, they put me in the English as a second language program where I had this amazing teacher I talk about a lot. Her name is Ann Jackson, and she was one of the few people at that time who recognized potential in me when I didn't see it, when nobody around me saw it. I'm sure my parents thought it, but it's my parents. She was the first outside person that was like her, like she can do something bigger if she actually learns the language. So she saw that I was curious and she saw that I liked books, but I was only like kind of reading like these like baby picture books. She was like, no, 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 no. And she grabbed a book that was a little bit more content heavy, fewer pictures, more words, and sent me home. And basically my assignment was like, go home, open the dictionary and start trying to understand what this is about. So I did that over and over and over again. And I got, there was like a book series that I loved. It was called like, it was about, I forget the name, but it was about this girl who solved crimes because she had like a memory, what was it? A photographic memory. She could like remember things on like page 72. And it was really cool. So I started getting into this and I learned the language that way, but also, you know, by being surrounded with people all the time and listening. And then in fifth grade, a new girl started at the school and she was also from Bulgaria. And that moment that you asked me about where I was like, oh man, I got this, was that the teacher asked me to go help translate something for her from English to Bulgarian. And I was like, I felt like the most powerful human in the world. I was like, oh, you need me.
You're kind of the superhero for that woman now.
Yeah, no.
What's really fascinating, and you talk about this even in present day a lot, which is this kind of thirst for curiosity, right? Is that something that was innate? Is there a reason why you're this curious kid that's always like looking for new information? Because that really fuels who you are today. But where does that stem for you? I'm just really curious, like where does that come from?
So I've thought about this a lot because for as long as I can remember, I was always asking questions to the point where my parents would get really annoyed. And I think because I grew up as an only child, I was constantly surrounded by adults. And when you're surrounded by adults all the time, they're having conversations that aren't like kid level, right? So I would be like, wait, what does that mean? And like, you know, like one of my mom's friends would be like, oh, and then he didn't call me back. And I was like, whoa, this is interesting. Why should he be calling me back? And so I learned about a lot of things that I think if I had only hung out with children my age, I wouldn't be as curious. I would know that. But I was always attracted to things that I didn't know. And I was honestly kind of nosy. And so I would like hear somebody say something here and then go tell it to somebody else. And some call it gossiping, other call it journalism. But it's just, I think by being surrounded by adults and by people that I didn't know who weren't my age, it was natural to ask questions because I wanted to be part of the conversation.
I can totally empathize with that because one thing you might not know, and I don't even know if listeners know this, I'm also an only child. I literally kind of experienced the same thing where I didn't have a kids table growing up, right? It was me and the adults, and you kind of have to learn everything from them and absorb and digest all this information that you might not understand. But the beauty is it kind of forces you to grow up faster and really step into your element. And that's what you did. So if we could hit an imaginary fast forward button and kind of zoom into what that lended to, right? Like you had all this experience, you finally learned the language, you went to college, and it's not easy. It's still not easy because you kind of are growing up with this immigrant type mindset. You step into college. College is a completely different beast. What did that moment in life, that 4-year period, whatever length that was for you, what did that teach you?
I loved college actually. I really enjoyed it because I think, a lot of people say, oh, you don't need college these days. You can learn everything online. True. But, and I argue about this with my husband, Anthony, all the time because he's one of those people who says that. But I think that it's a little bit different if you came here from another country or if you grew up in neighborhoods that weren't where everybody else grew up, right? So when you get to college, it's kind of, you start at a somewhat even playing field. Nobody knows who you are. Nobody knows where you came from. Nobody cares that you went to the shitty school and not the nice school. And you all got in to the same college. That's what matters. And then once you've established that baseline, from there you can do whatever you want. And that's how I saw college. So I got there in the first semester of my freshman year of college. I started working at the newspaper. I started shadowing other upperclassmen, other reporters, other editors. And I, because people knew they could rely on me, I got bigger and bigger assignments. Until then, I tried to learn every aspect of that newspaper. I was a reporter. I was a designer, a page designer. That was horrible, but I learned. I was assistant news editor, then managing editor, then editor in chief twice, once over the summer and once in the fall semester. It taught me so much. And I understand that this, like, it was part of the college experience, but I sought that out on my own. I did not learn that in the classroom. And if I had stayed only in class and not looked for other outside experiences where I could actually work, I would have never known that I hated editing. Like, I love writing and I love interviewing people. Editing does not come naturally to me. I don't enjoy it. And I frankly don't think I'm the best at it. So um, for me, college like was a way that it showed me that we can all start here and everybody goes into a different direction. They find out what they're passionate about. For me, I was a little bit obsessive in my pursuit of, I know exactly what I want. I love journalism. I'm curious and I want to continue developing this. So I'm going to put myself on this path and go. But I can also see how other people, it wasn't the right environment for them to learn.
What's valuable in you sharing that is that you kind of found that early in life, right? Not everyone finds it at all. Some people find it 10 years into their career. You found that very early on. If you're to distill some sort of kind of, let's call it advice, right? There are people who are out there maybe struggling. Everyone's pathway, especially over the last year, has been dramatically different. If you're in this process of soul searching and understanding what you want to do, where you want to go, how do you approach it as if you're talking to a friend right now?
Super easy. Ready?
Let's do this.
Audit your day, sit down and write about everything you do on a daily basis. How many hours do you sit in front of the computer and work at your job? How many hours do you spend on the phone with people, etc.? And then after you do this for, let's say, 2 or 3 days, then think about and look at the gaps in your schedule and ask yourself, what do I do for pleasure when I'm done with everything else? Like I am like over it. I've had a really stressful day at work. What do I do for myself? And I think people struggle to find that, like you said, because they don't think about that stuff as like, they think about it as hobbies. And I know a lot of people are like, ooh, find a passion project, find a side hustle, but you can't find that until you actually understand what you enjoy doing for pleasure. Naval asked this really great question. He says, identify what feels like play to you that feels like work to everybody else. I mean, I've known, so I haven't known my whole life that I wanted to be a writer or that I was curious or that I could make this into a living. I never thought a newsletter could turn into a full-time job. But like you see little clues here and there. So when I was in high school, I went to a magnet high school, and I was in the science magnet because both of my parents were chemical engineers. So I was like, obviously, I'm going to be a chemist. And when I was in high school, I understood very quickly that I wasn't good and I didn't enjoy the experiments, but I loved writing the 15-page lab reports. And I loved writing the lab reports because A, I liked writing, and B, I liked research. So like it, regardless of what you're doing, there's certain parts of things that you do that give you pleasure and that you like doing. I'm sure you don't, if you're currently employed at a job that you don't really like, I'm sure there's small parts of it that you maybe do enjoy, but it's not the overwhelming majority of what you do. So the question is, how can you turn those little parts into the big thing? And when I started the profile in 2017, I did it for personal sanity purposes only, because I wasn't happy with what I was doing at the time. I wasn't happy with the beat that I was covering, which was big tech and like ride sharing. And I was not passionate about that. But I was like, what can I do in my spare time that I actually enjoy? And it's having conversations with my friends about really interesting long form profiles that I've read that week. Super niche, super like specific thing. Never in my head that I think I would one day quit my job to do this full time. But as the years go on and time passes, certain opportunities present themselves to you where you're like, oh my God, I never thought about a paid newsletter. And then it happens.
So is it fair to say that the profile now is your personal lab report on everything you experience in life?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is.
I love that. So look, there's a lot of people who love and have read either your work in Fortune. As I've admitted, my wife has missed that newspaper, that editor, but she's back and she's writing something that's prolific. And you've done this incredible work with the profile. You go extremely deep. It was a side project. Again, before we kind of uncover some of the discoveries that you've made in those people, what I also want to shed light on is really connecting the dots of everything we just talked about. Some people might not figure out what they want to do early on in life. It takes them 10, 15 plus years. Some people think, aka Anthony might think, that you can learn everything online, and Elon Musk pushes this message all the time, right? There's so many different ways of learning, and there's so many different ways of starting businesses. And I like the fact that you said you have to audit your day. And in order to do that, that's where you're going to essentially take inventory of what you like and what you don't like. So I want to expand on that first, because it's really important for people to understand, what does that look like? So is it a form of journalism for you in terms of like, I have a journal, I sit down in the corner and I write, or is there some other process that you go through?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I noticed that when I was working at various jobs, the startup I mentioned, Fortune, and previously, I did keep like a journal where I would write like about the big moments in my life and things like that. But I noticed that I only wrote in it when something negative happened, like something like, oh, and I had to journal. But now, because I'm writing all the damn time, like that's become my life. So I don't feel the need to externally journal when I could take something and turn it into an idea, or use it as fuel to learn about someone in somebody's life and turn that into a profile dossier. I don't feel the need to express myself beyond what I'm currently doing. So what that looks like is, for me, is that every day I would sit down and I would write like, okay, 8 to 9 a.m., what do I do? 9 to 10, what do I do? 6 to 7 p.m., do I watch The Bachelorette or am I reading something? Sometimes it is The Bachelorette, but this goes into the idea of but like be as specific as you can, because otherwise if you say like, oh, I work from 8 to 5, but do you really? Or do you like take from 12 to 1 and you work on something else, or you're calling friends, or like just there are so many things that go on in our day that we're on autopilot and we miss them. And that's why I talk about this idea of a content diet, because few of us are very mindful of the information we're putting into our minds. We know exactly what we ate for lunch today, and we know if it was healthy or not healthy, but we don't think about, oh, wait, what do you mean that I only watch reality TV shows and that's affecting how I think? There's a theory that you are only as smart as the last piece of content that you consumed. You cannot be smarter than the information that you consume, because it's a lower threshold of like expanding your mind and making you think about other things. So so in your audit of your day, try to include some sense of, okay, and while I'm doing these activities, what types of content am I consuming?
That's so powerful. And I know that you often talk about a content diet. And to layer into that a little bit more, Buddha had this kind of profound quote that he said, or saying at the time, which was that our thoughts are not our thoughts. What we believe we become.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so powerful because if you're consuming things that aren't healthy, and we all know what they are, and we're not talking about food, we're talking about things that we read on the internet and social media, you become that. So be mindful of what you're going through. And I think you do that really powerfully. The profile is a really good place for people to consume content. And I know that, short of kind of talking about the profile as a whole, what I'm really interested in discovering and shedding light on is what you've learned through that process, right? Like, there are so many interesting people that you've had the opportunity to connect with, learn about. What are your like major headline findings in terms of the commonalities maybe, or the differences between people?
Yeah. So one thing that I've always tried to keep in mind that really helps me through life is you can always reinvent yourself. No matter what happens, whether you get fired, your entire world and life collapse, you can always get back up and reinvent yourself and do something new. I think on the topic of identity and labeling, if we label ourselves one way, it really limits us from becoming somebody else in the future. So, for example, when I was a writer at Fortune, I could have easily, and I did to a certain extent, think of myself as a journalist. I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. But suddenly, when I'm working on the profile and I'm doing all of this and I'm tech support and I'm editing the back end and all this stuff, I am all of those other things I never thought I would be. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a business owner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It takes a little bit for your brain to kind of shift and start thinking in that way, because to this day, I still have moments where I think like a writer. I don't think about how do I grow the profile? How do I make money? Like those are on the back burner for me. But having somebody like Anthony, who I can be like, oh, and by the way, this project is going to take me 3 days and I'm not going to do anything else. And he's like, oh, and he's like, okay, but like, well, that's going to be a great piece of content, but it's not going to be great for you if nobody reads it because you don't have enough people signed up for the newsletter. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. But when I was at Fortune, like I had other people doing that type of thinking for me. I never had to be the one asking the questions and thinking through it. So the biggest lesson I think is you can always reinvent yourself. One of my favorite stories about a person, his name is Richard Montagnes. He was a janitor who had a 4th grade level education, didn't speak any English. He was working as a janitor at Frito-Lay, and he noticed that a lot of the little Cheetos, as they were going on the conveyor belt, they weren't yet coated with, whatever to make Cheetos be Cheetos. So he was like, huh, that's interesting. My wife, like in the Hispanic community, we like things spicy. So my wife has this mix. I'm just gonna take it home and like see how it tastes. And he got home and they put the mix on. He was like, oh my God, this is delicious. Anyway, so long story short, this janitor with a fourth grade level education who nobody ever thought would amount to anything and nobody ever asked for his ideas, took that, went straight to the CEO and was like, I have an idea. And everybody's like, what is happening? And he was like, you don't have a big, in the Hispanic community, we like it this way. It's really good. Why don't you try it? And I'm happy, to help with this idea. He invented hot Cheetos, which turned I think billions of dollars for PepsiCo, which owns Frito-Lay. And then Richard went on to become a really big deal at PepsiCo. And he's spent pretty much his entire career there. But I think he had a great quote where he says, success doesn't mean, or intelligence isn't a diploma on the wall. Like just because you went to college doesn't mean you're intelligent or innovative. And I think if you can think that way and break yourself out of some of these like constraints and labels that society puts on you, you will be much more flexible in your life and your career. And you won't think like, oh my God, I've only spent a year at my job. I can't apply for another job, which I still think is the stupidest thing ever, where people are like, oh, I have to stay at my job for 6 more months because otherwise it'll look bad on my resume that I went and am applying to other jobs. Like, are you kidding me? But anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
Tell us how you really feel.
Yeah.
I think that story is incredibly mesmerizing. And it's such a good reminder that it literally doesn't matter where you are in life, what job you're in, what walk of life, what color of skin you are, you can have a great idea. The confidence, the courage is what matters more than anything.
Completely. I think Sarah Blakely puts it best. Every single person in their life has had $1 million idea, but she took action and you didn't. So that's why she's Sarah Blakely and I'm not a billionaire yet.
I love that. And let's dive into that because I know you've done a couple of things around different incredible people like Sarah Blakely, and you've learned and kind of extrapolated all these wisdom, all these nuggets that they've dished out to the world. But the reality is they were just being themselves. They were being their authentic selves. And then people reflect back on what they accomplished, what they said, and they think this is some wise quote, right?
Of course.
So in that process, right, you have this incredible opportunity now, day in, day out. It's not always easy, but you get an opportunity to interview people and talk to people and have these discoveries. Who are some of the people, without reflecting necessarily back on who you've already done a profile on, who are some of the people you're looking forward to in 2021?
Of doing profiles on?
Exactly.
So I'm currently working on one on Kobe Bryant, and he passed away last year today, and at the time of the recording of this podcast. And I honestly didn't know much about him. I had never looked into his life, and now I decided to do a dossier on him, and it's so interesting. Like it's just, to me, it's fascinating how he learns, and the way he learns is very similar to the way I learn. And I think that that's what's making me really interested in his life, because yes, he was an NBA All-Star and had all these crazy things that he did in basketball for 20 years. But then he was also he created a Hollywood short that won an Oscar. And then he became a venture capitalist and started investing. So those are 3 separate acts. And people kind of see it as like, oh yes, but he could only do it because he was Kobe Bryant. No, not really. Because if you know this, if you're in business, when you see a former athlete or an actor try to like now suddenly invest, you're like, okay, but honestly, that's not really smart money because they don't know what they're doing. And there's this element of like, you get dismissed. It's not because you're Kobe Bryant. It's because, oh, this is just a former athlete. What value are they going to add to this company by investing? But what Kobe did, and the reason he actually was respected, is that he surrounded himself with people he knew he could learn from, like really highly respected people. He calls it practicing, which I love. He's like, I started reading, I started writing, I was practicing. And to him, practice just means like getting better and better and deeper into your craft until you master it. When he wanted to play basketball, he wanted to be one of the best, he said he went to Goat Mountain, and Goat Mountain is the greatest of all time mountain. And he went to all the people that he respected, and he asked them for advice. Like, and what did you do that was different? Like, how did you, like super technical things. I think so few of us do that. And if you, like, what I always say is, if you ever want to be like someone, so for example, if I was like, hey, I want to follow in the exact footsteps and be as successful as Sarah Blakely, and let's say I'm in college, what I would advise you to do is identify that person, and then try to, or identify the person whose path you admire, but then try to do research. And if you can, talk to them and ask them about, okay, but like, what did you have to sacrifice to get there? And how often do you see your family? And would you do it all over again if you like had the chance? Because I think these stories get super sanitized, and I don't think people talk about like the gritty moments where it wasn't that great. I always try to include that aspect in the profile dossiers that I write, because yes, somebody's path may look great, but they're not going to tell you about those moments where they almost quit.
Exactly. First of all, I can't wait to read that one. I was a huge Kobe fan growing up. Obviously,
That's awesome.
It was just a challenging time last year when that went through, and who knew that the rest of the year was going to ensue the way it did. But one of the things I remember when in the present moment, and I was kind of role modeling towards Kobe, is that I remember he would wake up at Lower Merion High School at 5 a.m, go shoot free throws. Nobody was in the gym. Nobody sees that stuff in life, right? Like nobody sees when you're practicing, as you said, right? To me, it's always about you're kind of rehearsing for your future, where you have this opportunity to learn, to understand, to really go through the motions, because our brains don't actually know the difference between reality and what we're doing in real life. So that's what's really cool about Kobe. And I appreciate you sharing that about him. If you could reflect back to maybe one of your favorite dossiers that you had done over the last few years, which ones come to mind the most?
Definitely the one that I did on Grant Achatz, who's this chef who created the restaurant called Alinea. And his restaurant was named the best in the world, but that's not why I find it interesting. I find it interesting because Grant is one of the, if not the most innovative creators and chefs, I think, of our time. And you think you're a good chef, you think you're an original chef, and then you get staged for tongue cancer and can't taste the food. So an event like that would crush most people. They'd be like, God, like the one thing in my life is to taste food. And now I have tongue cancer. Of all the cancers, I have tongue cancer. And that period of his life, he became, instead of framing it in a negative way, which I think most of us would, he framed it as like, okay, how can I get even better with this? And so he realized that the majority of taste doesn't actually come from the tongue and our taste buds. It comes from visual, what we see, and smell, and what we smell. So he was able to like play with elements that made him an even better chef because of that. I think it's just a really good story about original thinking, thinking from truly first principles, and framing failure in a way that only creates opportunity instead of taking it away.
I love that. It's definitely surprising to hear that somebody with such a, call it, traumatic experience can recover and turn it into a positive. And I hope that this entire conversation serves for people as a reminder that You can literally change your life every single day if you choose to. You just have to make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find empowering with the profile is that you're doing what you finally love and you're doing it on a consistent basis and you figured it out, right? You don't have to have everything figured out every single day. But again, in the same light that you look at people and some of their challenges, what are, if you want to disclose, what are some of the challenges that you might go through as you're kind of going through the process of writing?
Oh gosh, I mean, so many things. Like sometimes I'll have an idea and I'll start writing, and then I'll be like, oh, it's hard. It's hard to write about this. And I think sometimes it's hard because I don't feel very strongly about it. I'm just like, oh, I thought this was a good idea last week. And now, like, I'm not very excited about it. So I have two or three things that are kind of unfinished. On the flip side of that, when I'm really excited about something and I'm writing it, and I get to the end and I'm like, I'm so excited to publish it. And then I'm like, oh, wait. And then I start tinkering with it. And then I start changing things. And like, I'm like, oh, it's not exactly perfect. It's not even close, but like, I'm really excited about it. And I always keep in mind that Da Vinci quote where he says, nothing is ever, nothing creative is ever finished, only abandoned. So that's literally how I feel 99.9% of the time. But the other thing is that, like, sometimes, okay, I'll give you a really good example. I think the biggest thing I've learned is you cannot plan success, or whether people will like something. And I have a pretty good sense of my taste, and that if I find something interesting, other people are likely to find it interesting. But for example, I did a dossier on Dwayne The Rock Johnson, and at the time, I was like, this isn't my best work, because for me, the dossiers are super, super specific. I try to make them super practical, where there's like, yes, there is a person, but there are certain tactics you can take away for and use in your own life. And I thought that The Rock's one, it was good. I liked it. I like him as a person, but I felt like it was too motivational and not practical enough. So I was like, I'm just going to publish it on a day where I don't think anybody's going to read it, which was Christmas Eve. So I scheduled The Rock's dossier to go out on Christmas Eve, and then it published. And then I tweeted, hey, like, I just published The Rock, and I tagged him. And a few hours later, I wasn't looking at my phone, and it looks like The Rock responded. And not only did he like it, he shared the dossier all over the internet. And I was like, oh my God, I thought this wasn't my best work, and now it's everywhere. But you just never know who's reading, and you cannot plan for success. You can't plan for the moments of luck. Recently, I read something about how every piece of writing, every podcast, every single thing that you create, by sharing it publicly, it's actually a vehicle of serendipity. This is not my words. Somebody said this, and I can't remember who it was, but it's a vehicle for serendipity, because I can tweet something and The Rock might see it. Like, that's crazy. I would have never reached out to The Rock and sent him that. Maybe I should have. But every single thing you create, you open yourself up for some weird serendipitous event to propel your work forward.
That is so powerful. I don't know if 8-year-old Polina would have thought that one day she'd be connected to The Rock, let alone having him share your work. But that's what life's about, right? It's just putting out this powerful energy into the world through whatever medium it is for you, and then really giving yourself an opportunity to shine. It's that simple. So look, before we let every guest off the hook, we want to make sure that we stump you, we challenge you, and put you through the hot seat. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm not very good with like the fast ones because I have to think, but let's just try it.
We'll make it fun. All right. I always like to ask people this question, which is really that I believe that everyone is both a student for life and a teacher for life. And if you had an opportunity to learn something completely new, what would it be? And part two of the question is, if you could teach people one thing, what would it be?
Ooh. So what? God, see, like I'm so bad at these. Okay, if I could learn something new, so I've always wanted to be a dolphin trainer.
Did not
But
expect that.
I know. But I would love to learn just like, I mean, okay, first of all, you can learn so much about psychology and like behavior through coaching dolphins. Like what motivates them? When do you pull back? Like all that kind of stuff. I think that's fascinating. So dolphin training is one thing I would love to learn and to teach. I think I would love to teach something. Okay, something like really mushy, but teach it in a practical way is confidence. I always find that the things that people want to teach are something that has been kind of an insecurity for them in the past. The reason you have this podcast, probably because at some point in your life you felt confused about your career path. Maybe, but I think is that right?
Absolutely. I mean,
Okay, good.
you pretty much hit the nail on the head.
But I do think that the things that we value the most and we want to tell others about are as a result of an insecurity we once had. For me, confidence was always such a big problem in the way that I think when people look at me, they're like, oh, she's confident. And then I would go home and be like, oh my God. And it's such a mismatch between the way people see you and the way you see yourself. But I would love to like try to work on something where it's like super practical things that you can use to build your own confidence and never let other people believe in you more than you believe in yourself.
Confidence is a strange one, right? You said it perfectly, which is we don't know how people perceive us. We might just be putting out this strange version of ourselves, but to somebody
Exactly.
else, they love it. I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, and it's one that I find pretty entertaining, but we'll see where it goes. So, if you had to go to your Bulgarian parents right now
Okay.
and explain to them what Bitcoin is,
Oh God.
what would you tell them?
Oh, it's what Anthony likes. So, it's really funny. Before I was about to introduce Anthony to my dad, and this was in 2017. And and Bitcoin had been like around on the news because 2017 was a big run or whatever. And my dad was like, we were talking about Bitcoin the day before Anthony showed up, but I hadn't told him that that's what Anthony does or anything because I was still in the beginning. And my dad was like, God, this Bitcoin and all these criminals and using this money and the underground, whatever. And I know about this. Only criminals use this. And then I was like, me and Anthony. No. And he explained it to him in a way that was like, okay, when you were in Bulgaria and there was like crazy inflation and all your entire salary got devalued, let me introduce you to how like this can work and affect that. And he understood it and now like loves Bitcoin, which is funny. But yeah, I think it's like money that can't be messed with. That's how I would explain it.
It's money that when you had $30,000 coming from Atlanta, what can be amplified to actually give you a living in New York. Thank you for sharing that story. I find it pretty comical, and I'm sure many people will. Look, Polina, you are an incredible human who's empowering so many people through sharing these dossiers about people, and keep doing it. I'm excited to read about Kobe Bryant. If people want to connect with you, people want to find you on the internet, what's the best way for them to do that?
On Twitter, I'm at Polina_Marinova, and you can find me at Polina@readtheprofile.com if you have any, feedback or just want to chat.
Awesome. Make sure to follow Polina. Check out the profile. You're going to learn so much. Polina, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And as we always say at Career Meets World, go unleash your wildest potential. Thank you so much.
Thank you.